Hello Hood coders and welcome back. So in this course we are going to learn how to use Firebase together with Jetpack Compose, and we'll build a simple note application. So the first step is to authenticate a user and allow CRUD operations. So guys, without any further delay, let's code together and build the note application. Okay, so before we start here, you can just get the initial project inside our GitHub repository. So as you can see here, I have added several dependencies inside our build.gradle here, or you can just easily copy them and you are just good to go. So now let's get started. Okay, so the first step here is to connect our application with Firebase console. So we can easily do this inside Android Studio. When we navigate here to tools, and you can find this Firebase button here, which is going to load up the assistant, which is going to help us to connect to the console. And we have to locate here to authentication, and we want to select this authenticate using Google, and we want to connect this to Firebase. So for case here, we can just click this button here. Okay, now here the Firebase console has detected that this is going to be our nodes. So we're just going to click here continue so that we can easily create this project here. And we don't want to enable this analytics here, so we can just click create project, and this is just going to create our project. Okay, so our project is ready here. We can just click continue so that we can just add these applications here. So we can just easily connect here. Now our project is already connected, so we can just easily navigate back to Android Studio, and as you can see here, we have connected here, and we have other buttons which we can just easily add here the SDK, but I have already added these SDKs or the dependencies which we want to use them. As you can see here, we have already imported this bomb, and this is just going to select all of the Firebase compatible versions, and we can just easily use them. Now here, when we navigate inside the Firebase console, we can just come here to all products, and we want to select this authentication product here so that we can just get started. And now let's just get started here by enabling this authentication inside our application, and we can just select our providers or what we want to use for authentication purposes. And for case, we are going to select email and passwords here, and we want to enable this email and password, and we can just easily save here. And for that case here, our email and password has already been added. And for now, we want to come here inside our project, and we go to our project settings. And we have to add here the SH certificate here, which we can just easily generate inside Android Studio. And before we just generate this, we have to download this Google Service JSON so that we can add it inside our application. So for now, we are just going to download this. Okay, so now when you finish to download this, you can just navigate inside the folder where you have downloaded this, and we can just easily copy this, and we can just easily navigate inside our build project here, and we have to select here our project, and we can just paste this inside here. Okay, now we can just switch back here to our Android view, and we can just easily close this. Okay, so the next thing, we have to generate the SH certificate, and we can just easily generate this from the Gradle here. And as you can see here, we don't see where we can just easily use the sign-in report. So for this case, we can just press this button here, and we want to disable this experimental feature here, do not build Gradle tags. And we can just click here, apply, and we click OK. And we have to sync our project so for this to work. So we can just come here, and we want to sync project with Gradle files and wait for the Gradle to build. So the Gradle has finished to build here, so we can just navigate inside here Android, and we want to click the sign-in report here so that we can just easily generate here the SH certificates. Now we can just select here the SH1 certificate, so we can just copy this, and now we can just easily navigate back to our browser so that we can just start to use it. Okay, now we can just easily navigate here inside our SH certificate, and we want to add here a fingerprint, and we can just easily paste it here. And we can just click save here in order to save this SH certificate. And I think we are just good to go and start to code. Okay, now let's start to code here. So the first thing, we want to create a repository where we can just easily authenticate our user. And for this case, we can just navigate inside here our node, and we can just create a new package. and we want to call this out repository. And we want to create here a first class, so we can just create here a coding class, and we want to call this authentication repository. Okay, so inside here repository, we want to get the current user, so we can just call this current user. And this is just a normal Firebase user. And now we can just use this Firebase object here, which is just a variable in Kotlin. And we can just call auth, and we want to get the current user. And this is just going to return the current user. Okay, so we want to check if the user is going to be logged in or not. And for this case, we have to create a function that is going to help us to decide this. So we can just call this as user. And this is just going to return a Boolean. And we can just easily use the Firebase object again. And for this case here, we want to check this is not going to be equal to null. And for this case, we know that the user has been logged in. And also we want to get the user ID. So we can just call this get user ID. And this is just going to return a string. And for this case here, we can just call here firebase.auth. And also we want to get the current user. And here now we want to get the user ID. And here we can just call or empty if this is just going to be null. Okay. Now for our case here, we want to create another function that is going to create the actual user. And this is just going to be a suspend function. So we can just call this create user. And here basically we want to pass in the email. And also we want to pass in here password. And we want to have another function that is going to be the onComplete. And this is just going to return a Boolean here. Okay, so we want to switch the threads between the main thread to the IO. So we can just use a dispatcher. So we can just call here with context. And we want to use the dispatcher.io. And this is just going to change the threads. And for this case here, now we want to create the user. So we can just use the Firebase object. And here we want to select this authentication. And we want to create user with email and password. And here basically now we can just pass in the email and password. And also we want to add the onComplete listener. And for this case here, we can just check if this is going to be successfully. And now here, basically, we can just call here our onComplete. And we can invoke this with true. And else here, we can just invoke this onComplete listener with a false. So this is just going to bring us the feedback so that we can just easily create. And we know that we have created successfully the user. And for that case here, we want to call the await function. So we don't want to block the main thread. So beside this, we can just call here await. Okay, so this was just for creating a user. Now let's create another function, which is just going to help us to log in a user. So it's just going to be similar to this, but we can just easily change here to be login. And for case here, instead of create user, so we can just call here sign in with email and password. And for that case, we have already completed to create our two login and the sign out. Okay, now let's create here another package, which is just going to be for our login screens and other things. So we can just call this login. And here we can just create here a login screen. And here we want to create our login view model. And now this is just going to inherit from the view model. And here we can just create the private val. We want to get the repository. So we can just call this repository. Okay, now below this, we can just create here a data class that is going to hold up our UI state, because we could have numerous UI states. So we can just group them inside our UI, our data class. So we can just call this login UI state here. And here we want to provide variables. So the first thing here, we are just going to create a username, for example. And we can just initialize this to an empty string for the first. And here also we want to provide the password. And also we want to duplicate this for the sign up page. So we can just call this username sign up. And also here we can change this to sign up. And also we want to create here a confirm password. Okay, also we want to create here a state if this is going to be loading. So we can just call this is loading. And for this case, we can just initialize this to false. And also we can check if this is just successfully. And here we can just provide the sign up error. And also we want to create the login error. And we can just initialize this to be null for the first time. Okay, now we can just jump inside here our view model. And now we can just get our current user. So we can just call this current user. And here we can just call this repository.current user. And also we want to create another variable here, and we can just call this has user. And this is just going to return a boolean, and we can just define here a get function. And here we want to call our repository.has user. And for that case, we are just going to get the user. Okay, also here we want to create our login state. So we can just call here login UI state. And we can just create here a mutable state of. And we want to call here our login UI state. And we want to import these values here. Okay, now let's create our events which are going to modify our state. So we can just call here, and here we have to specify this to be private set. So this can be only modified inside here our view model. And also now we can just define here our events which are going to modify the UI. So we can just call here on username change. And here basically we can just provide username, which is just going to be a string. And we can just call here login UI state, and we want to reinitialize this, and we want to copy here, and we can change the username back to the username which we have provided here. And we can do the same to the rest of other items. And here we can just call on password change. And here basically now we can change the password. And here basically we can just change the sign up, and we can just pass in here the username, and here we want to change the sign up username. And also here we can just change the password. And here basically we can change the on confirm password. Okay, so these are just the events which are going to modify our state. And now we want to write our function which is going to help us to create a user. But first we want to validate these forms if they are not empty, because we don't want to authenticate a user without any fields. So we can just create here a private function, and we can just call this validate login form. So we can just call here our login UI state, and we want to get the username, and we don't want this to be is blank. And also here we can just check here, and we want to check also this is not going to be blank. Also we can just provide another function which is just going to check up the so here we're going to validate the sign up forms. So we can just call here our login UI state, and here we have to check this is not going to be blank. Okay, so here we can validate our forms. So now let's create a function that is going to help us to create the user. Okay, now let's create here a function which is just going to create a user. And here basically we can just pass in a context because we want to display a toast message. So we're just using this context here for displaying that. And for this case here, now we can just use the viewModel scope. And we can just launch this. Okay, now we can just use here a try catch block here. So we want first to throw errors if our forms are going to be invalid. So we can just check here if this form is, we want to validate these forms. So we can just validate the forms. And if this is just going to be true here, so we are just negating this value, and we want to throw an illegal argument exception. And here we can just say email and password. And here we can just provide the catch. Okay, now we want to make here our function is going to be loading. So we can just call here our login UI. And also we want to check here if the confirmation passwords are not equal. So we can just check here if the sign up password. So we can just use here our login UI state. So when this is not going to be equal, so we can just throw another illegal argument exception. And here basically we can just say password do not match. And if we have passed this, we can just use our login UI state, and we can just copy here. And we want to turn this back to null. So we are going to start again. So these errors have been passed. Okay, now we can just call here our repository. And we want to create the user. And here we have to pass in the email and password. And we can just call here our login UI state. And we want to pass in here the sign up name. And here we want to pass in the sign up password. And here we want to check if this is going to be successfully or not. And if this is just going to be successfully, we can just easily toast here message. So we can just check if this is successfully. And here we can just pass in the context. Okay, so if this is just successfully, also we want to provide the state. So we can just call here our login UI state. And here basically we want to pass in that successfully login. And here we want to make it to be true. And else here we can just create another toast message, or we can just copy this. And here we can just call it fail. And for that case also we can just change here our UI state. And we want to make is success login back to false. Okay, now let's deal here with our exceptions. And for case here, if we get any exception, we can just call here our login UI state. And we want to pass in here the error. So we can just call here copy and call the sign up error. And here we can just get the exception.localized message, which is just going to give us the error. And also we can just call here e.print struct trace so that we can just get this to our logcat. And for that case here, we can just call here finally. And for this case here, we can just call here login UI state. And here basically we want to disable the loading progress bar. So we can just call here login UI state.copy. And here basically we can just change is loading back to false. Okay, so I think here this is just our function which is going to help us to create a user. So we can just easily copy this. And we want to duplicate this again. And instead here of creating a user, we're just going to call this login. And here basically we can just remove this validation here because we're just going to use this single validation here. And here we want to call validate forms. So we want to check if the login forms are empty, then we have to throw this illegal argument exception. And for this case here, we can just pass in here the sign in error. And instead here of create user, so we can just call here login. And basically here also we want to change, we want to use the username. And also here we want to use the password. And also we are just going to leave this everything as is because we know that. And instead here we can just change this sign up error here to be a login error. And here we can just easily leave everything as they are. Okay, so I think here our view model is complete. Now let's navigate inside here our login screen so that we can just start to create our login screen. So let's create here a new composable and we're just going to call this login screen. Okay, now let's create here several parameters. So we have the login view model and we're just going to make this nullable, and because we want to use a preview function, so we are just going to pass this to be null. And here we want to provide the on navigations. So we want to call this on navigate to homepage. And this is just going to return nothing. And also here we want to navigate to the login page. So for example, here we want to navigate to the sign up page. Okay, now let's create here an instance of login UI. And here basically we can just call here login view model. And we can just easily get our UI state here. And also we want to check if there is an error. So we can just call this is error. And now we can just use here our login UI state. And we want to get this is not going to be equal to null. So we know that this is just going to be an error. And also we want to get the context. So we can just call here context. Okay, now let's create here a column. And here basically we are going to pass in a modifier. And we want to fill the max size. And here we can just pass in the horizontal alignment. And we want to center everything horizontally. Okay, now let's create here our first item. We are going to create here a text. And we are just going to call this login. And here we want to provide a style. And we can just use here a material theme. And we want to use header 3. And also here we want to provide the font weight. And we want to make this black. And also we want to change the color, so we can just make this material theme. And we want to use the primary color. Okay, so the next thing here, we want to check if there is any error so that we can just display it here to the user. So we can just check here if is error. And basically now we can just show the user that we have an error. So we can just create here a text. And for this case here, we can just use our login UI state. And we want to check for login error. And if this is going to be null, so we want to call this unknown error. And here we can just change the color. This we can make the color red. Okay, also here we can just create a preview function. And we can just call this prev login screen. And here basically we want to show the system UI, so we can just call here show system UI, and we can make this to be true. And here we can just call the not theme application, so the not theme function here, and basically we can just call here our login screen. Okay, so this is just our preview here. Now let's continue to add other items. Okay, now let's create here an outline text field, and here we want to pass in the values, so we can just use our login UI state. And we want to select the username, and if this is just going to be null, so we are just going to pass in here an empty string. And here on value change, so we can just use here our login view model. And here we want to call the on username change. And basically we can just pass in here it, so that it can just reflect that. Also here we can just easily pass in a modifier. And we want to provide here a padding of 16 dp. And also we want to fill the max width. Okay, so let's provide here a leading icon. So this is just the icon before the text field. And here basically now we can just provide the icon. And we can just use the icons here. And here we can just provide this person here. And basically here we are going to pass in to be null. Okay, also here we want to pass in a label, so we can just call here label. And here, for example, we can just call this to be email. And we want to make this text field to show an error if there is an error. So we can just call here is error. So this is just going to automatically change the color of the text fields. Okay, now let's create here a password, and we can just easily duplicate this. And instead here of username, we can just easily pass in here password, and here we can just call on password change. And here we can basically use the log here to show the icon, and here we can just change to be password. And also here we can add one item, which is just called here the visual transformation, which is just going to transform this to hide the password which is entered. So we can just call here password visual transformation. Okay, now let's preview the changes we have made. Okay, so I think everything is looking good. Now let's finish up to add other items. Okay, now let's create here a button which is going to help us to submit these forms. And here inside the on click, so we can just create here a text first. And we can just call this sign in. And we can use here a login view model, and we want to log in the user. So we can just call here login user. And here we want to provide the context, which is just we have created above there. Okay, now let's create here a spacer. And here we want to create a space of 16 dp. So we want to create also the text here, which are going to ask the user if they don't have an account so that they can sign up. So we can just create here a row, and here we can just pass in here a modifier. And we want to fill the max width. And here we want to pass in the horizontal arrangement. And we want to arrange this to the center here. Okay, now here we want to provide the first text. So we can just provide here our text. And also we can just create here a spacer of 8 dp. And also here we can just create a text button. And here we want to and we can just call this sign up. And here we want to invoke our navigation. So we can just call here on nav to sign up page. And we can just invoke here if the user clicks this button here. Okay, now let's preview our changes we have made. Okay, so far so good. So I think everything is looking good. Now we want to display here the progress bar if this is going to be loading. So we can just easily navigate here and create an if statement. So we can just check here. If our login UI state is loading, and this is just going to be equal to true, then we have to show the circular progress bar. So we can just call here circular progress indicator. And for this case here, we are just going to get this loading or spinning animation. And also here we want to create a launched effect. So when the user is successfully launched in, we want to navigate to the home page. And for this case here, we can just use here a login view model. And we want to check if has user. And we are using here a launched effect because this is just a side effect. This has user here is going to arise from Firebase and not Jetpack Compose. And for this case here, we could have multiple changes and the state could be out of sync. So when we are calling here launch the effect, is going to smooth everything and launch this whenever this has changed, has user is actually changed. And then we can just run this block of code here. And now we can just check here if login view model. And we want to call this has user and is actually true. And if this is the case, then we want to navigate to the home page. So we can just call here on navigate to home page, and we can just invoke this function. And for that case, when the user is successfully logged in, then we can just actually navigate to the home page. Okay, now I think here we have finished to create our login screen. Now let's create here our sign up page, and we can just easily duplicate this, and we can just modify this same screen here in order to match our sign up screen. And instead of login screen here, we can just call this okay. Now we can just easily change here a login error, so we don't want this. And first and foremost here, we want to navigate to the sign in page here. So for example, here we can just change. We have to navigate here to the login page instead of the sign up page. And also here, the login error, we have to change this to sign up page or sign up error, and everything will leave them as they are. Okay, so also here we have to change this to be sign up. And here we want to also change this login error, and we have to change this to sign up error, and then everything is okay. And now let's navigate here inside our outline text fields here. And instead of using here the username, so we can just use the username sign up. And here on username change, we can just use on username change. And we want to use the sign up thing here, and everything is okay. And also we can just easily navigate here inside our password. And here we want to change here password sign up. And here pass on password sign up change. And also we want to duplicate this because we want to provide that confirmation of password. And here we can just change here password confirmation. And here we can just change this to confirm password. And here inside the button, instead of logging the user, we want here to create the user. So we can just call here create user, and also we have to pass in here the context. And we can just navigate here instead of on navigate to sign up page. We can use here the on navigate to login page, and we have to invoke. And here we can just change here. And we can just ask if the user already has an account, then we can just use this to navigate to the sign up page. So I think here our sign in page is ready. So we can just call this sign in instead of sign up. Now let's create another preview function here. So we can just duplicate again this, and here we can just call this preview sign up screen, and we can just easily call here our sign up screen. And now let's preview the changes we have made. Okay, so far so good. So everything is looking good. As you can see here, we have all of our screens ready to use. So now what has remained here is to create a mechanism for navigations and also finishing up the home screen. So we can just create here another package. And we want to call this home. Okay, now let's create here a new coding class or file. And here we want to create a home page. And for now here we can just create a new composable, and we are just going to call this home. And for now we are just going to display a text because we are just going to navigate here. And later here we are going to build up the home screen here. And this we can just call this. Okay, now let's create here a new coding class or file. And now we want to call this navigation. Okay, so now we want to navigate here, and the first thing here we want to create the routes, and we can use an enum class here, and we want to create the login routes. And here we are going to have the sign up page and the sign in page. And also here we can create another enum class, and here we are just going to have the home routes. And here we have our home page, and also we are going to have a detail screen. And I think basically there we are just good to go. Okay, so here we have to pass in several parameters, and the first one is just the nav controller. And here we can just call remember nav controller. And also we want to get the login view model, which is just going to come from the main activity. And for that case here, we can just create our nav host. And here we want to create our starting route. This is just our start destination here, and we can just using the login view model, login routes, and we want to select the sign in page. And here basically now we can just create our composable. Okay, now we want to specify here the route. And basically here we can just use the login routes. And here basically now we can just call our composable. So we want to call in here the login screen. And here we want to navigate to the home page. So we can just call here of controller. And here basically now we can just use the home routes. And we want to pop up to, and we want basically to pop up to this route here. So we can just provide here our route, and we want to call the login screen, login routes. So we want to remove this from the back stack here, and we can just call this inclusive and make it to be true. And for this case, when we navigate to the home page, when we click the back button, we are going to quit the application and not going back to our sign in page or sign up page. And for that case, we are just going to use this mechanism here. Okay, so here we want to navigate to our sign up page. So we can just call here nav controller, and we want to navigate. And here we can just call our login routes. And here we can just call here our pop-up, and we want to call here login routes. And also we can just make this to be inclusive and make it to be true. And also here we want to call launch single top. And we want to make this to be true. So that is just going to create one instance of this inside our back stack and not multiple instances. So we can just make also this to be true. And for that case, we have only one item and not multiple items of the same screen inside our application. Okay, now let's create here another composable. And here we want to create our sign up route. So we can just call this route and call here login routes. And also here we can just call here our sign up screen. And here basically now we want to navigate, so we can just call here our nav controller. And here we want to call home route, and we want to navigate to the home. And also here we want to use this inclusive here. Okay, and also here we can just deal with this on navigate to home page, and this is just where we're supposed to call this. And here is just the navigation back to the sign in page. So we can just call here the nav controller. And basically here now we can just call our login routes. And for that case, also we can just define here another composable, which is just going to be for our home screen. So we can just call here route. And here we want to use home routes. And basically here now we can just call here our home screen. And we don't have anything to navigate to when we get inside our home screen. Okay, now let's navigate here inside our main activity. And inside here now we want to create a variable for our view model. Now we can just call this login view model. And we can use a view model function here. And we want to provide the model class, which is just going to be our login view model. And now here we can just call our navigation. And basically here now we can just pass in our login view model. Okay, now let's test our application. And before we run here, we call the sign in report. So we can just change this back to our application, and let's launch this inside our app. Okay guys, so when we launch our application, we are just getting this error here. So the default Firebase app is not initialized. So I think we have forgotten to add this inside our build.credo projects. So we can just navigate here, and here we want to apply this plugin here. So we want to add this com.google.gms Google services in order to make it to sync properly. And also we have to navigate inside here our build.credo file. Also here we have to add this dependency here, com.google.gms Google services 4310. And now let's try to sync the project and see the changes we have made. Now our build.credo file has finished to sync. Now let's try to run our application again and see the changes. So our application has launched successfully. However, when we try to type inside these text fields here, nothing happens. And this is because we have forgotten to use this view model here. So we can just pass in inside here our view model. And also inside here the sign up page, also we can just pass in here a view model. And now let's try to rerun again the application and see the changes. Okay, now our application has launched successfully. So here, for example, if we try to sign in without anything, as you can see here, we're getting an error. Now let's jump inside here, our sign up page here. So for example, here we can just create a new email. So for example, here ABD, and we can try to pass in here password 123456. And here also we can try 123456 7. And then when we try here, we are just getting here password do not match error. So when we remove this and try again, so we are going to sign in here and we navigate to the home screen successfully. So guys, for this video, let's leave it here. So in the next video, we're going to speak how we can easily incorporate Firestore to this application so that we can save and retrieve data. So if you find value out of these videos, please don't forget to provide a like and subscribe for more video. So let's leave it here. See you in the next video. Bye bye for now.